Hello, friends, and welcome back to Artist Questions. This is the mostly weekly live stream where we look at some of the biggest questions facing contemporary artists today. My name's Dan Curtis. I am an artist, a writer, and head of education at Exchange Art, who make all this possible. Shout out to the amazing Fevra, again, great producer who produced our intro track there. Haven't shouted him out for a few episodes, so I thought I'd do that today. Go and check out his work. If you liked the vibe of the beats that we had at the start there. So we are on episode 3 of our mini series, Smashing Imposter Syndrome. Episode 3 of 3, the trilogy, the Great Trinity comes to an end, unfortunately. The last few weeks, we've been looking at how imposter syndrome, the idea as a concept, came to be through through the research. We looked at the work of Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes in coining the term and researching it among high achieving women and how it applies to artists. And we've looked at things like the compare and despair cycles and thinking about how curiosity, slowness, and the taxonomy of all of life can be unhealthy, and we need to come back to a slowness and a focus on community in ridding ourselves of imposter syndrome. And last week we focused a lot on sort of the internal idea of why, as artists, we might feel like imposters in the art world or amongst our art peers. And then this week we are going to be looking at that same idea, but in context of the wider world. And so today's title is My Art Can't Change the World, So Why Bother? And looking at this feeling that what we're doing doesn't really matter in the wider scheme of things, and what's it all about, and how imposter syndrome sort of is actually, I think, at the root of some of those feelings. So we're going to look at a couple of sort of contextual ideas today, philosophical ideas about where some of this stuff comes from, and then hopefully a reframing in terms of ways that I think can help you to break out that idea of your art needing to change the world in some way. So we're going to start with Amy McNee. Is always a great place to start. Amy McNee is a great author of fiction and also an arts educator and author of the recent amazing book We Need Your Art. And in her recent TED talk on the importance of making art, she starts by saying the world is literally and figuratively on fire. So how is making art a good idea at the moment? What's the point of playing around with paint or wool or stone or paper when the world feels like it's going to shit, right? And it's a big question. When the world does feel like it's on fire, when we're living through genocide and so much pain, when the art world is full of nepotism and wealth disparity, when no one seems to care about what I do, it can make us feel like, as artists, either we're not doing enough or what we do won't make a difference anyway. It can also feel like, and we talked about this in the last few weeks and in this episode on curiosity, that it's a kind of art becomes like a sort of silly, cute, sweet thing, an indulgence that is completely different to like the serious act of being involved in changing the world and helping the world. And also, alongside that, it can be seen as non productive, as it's sort of frivolous in some way to the more moral and important things of life. But as we are aware, and Amy talks about some of this research in her TED talk, that serious play and the creative act in a world that constantly demands consumption is massively important in terms of our neurological development and our self-development. In fact, she calls creativity and art the kind of missing element of self-development, where we've got podcasts talking about every aspect of doing exercise or breath work or whatever else. And it's one of the missing things, because on the one hand it's seen as kind of non-productive in this very sort of hyper goals focused world that we can find ourselves in, or that it's just like a silly add-on. And I found it really helpful, that idea that of reminding us that play affects us physiologically and neurologically. And I'm going to do an episode on play next week, and experimentation, how important that is for us as artists. But aside from that, I also find it kind of unbelievable that we're at the stage in culture, for ourselves as artists as well, but particularly for those who don't really engage in anything creatively, don't make any art, where people are so creatively disengaged that we kind of have to convince people to do something creative with sort of science backed research, that it will somehow add to metrics, higher metrics within your productivity, and that makes it sort of worthwhile as an act. And I think, as Amy says, living in a culture that sidelines the creative act as an add-on or needing to be justified by sort of productivity metrics is a narrative that's actively harming us as humans and reducing our humanity, in fact. And Amy immediately goes on to say that, in a world that feels like we have little control and increasingly meaningless our actions, art is actually a form of agency, in where we can take back some control of our life and create something that's different. And it speaks into something I want to spend a little bit of time on, thinking about this idea of meaninglessness, into a kind of contemporary condition that a lot of us are living in, which is that the idea that the kind of future is dystopian now, that the idea of the future is the world collapsing, things falling apart, and are not being able to imagine a better way forward for our own planet, our own economy, and our own creativity. And that can lead us to this kind of sense of despair and a couple of other things which we'll look at now. And when Amy was talking about this idea of this increasing feeling of meaninglessness, I was brought back to, in memory, to the work of Mark Fisher, who was a writer and philosopher. And he wrote a book on hauntology, and the book Capitalist Realism, which is really, really worth looking at if for all artists, I think, in terms of how capitalism functions now and how we might sort of battle against it as artists. But in Capitalist Realism, he draws attention to a shift that he calls post-Fordist economics. It sounds a bit heavy going, but Ford meaning like Henry Ford, the creator of the Ford cars, and he obviously creating a economic model where the entire production line was built one thing at a time in a factory. Yeah, that's kind of famous for that. But now that these things no longer occur, and instead work has kind of spread out to all different areas, just to reflect the market rather than to, be in control of the product that you're creating. And since the 1970s, where the kind of, I guess, like particularly in the UK and in America, like the factories started closing, those areas of, the ownership of production and people having work and therefore leisure time or space, or then funding from within the government for universities to be cheaper and stuff like that. Since that started to get extracted and pulled upwards, Fisher argues that this sort of gradual upwards movement of wealth in this post-Fordist economy has gradually and systematically deprived artists of resources necessary to produce new things or produce the new. So we end up stuck in this cycles where we're so exhausted and finding it so difficult to know what to do or feel as if our work is making any impact, because there's so little ability to produce new things when there's so little resource around us. And we see the sort of post-Fordist economy and things like the gig economy, 0 hours contracts, much more personal risk when you're putting yourself out there. Influencers now being a job where everything is focused on you, taking much more personal risk in what you're doing, very immediate jobs that don't last very long, immediacy in finance, and not much sort of longevity. And Mark Fisher, in sort of talking about this idea then of like a future that seems dystopian, he is kind of famous for popularizing the phrase, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." And there's a quote from Hauntology where he says that there's this kind of feeling that the future has somehow evaporated from us. And there's a nice little quote here from a site called Modernist Unbound, which I was looking at earlier, who've done some writing on Fisher's work. And they were saying that capitalist realism is more than sort of like a political economical system. It's this atmosphere or a silent belief that nothing will ever change for the better, which gradually has come to narrow the individual and collective imagination and expresses itself in the form of so-called reflexive impotence, like a sort of inability for us to understand where we are and therefore create new things or feel like what we're doing has any long-term impact. For example, they go on to say, why should we care when everything will only get worse anyway? And then, with the kind of rise of AI, Amy actually in her TED talk talks about a DM that she's got, which says, AI is just going to make all my work better and faster. So what's the point? This sort of idea that the future is evaporating and that therefore our work is somehow a waste of time, in what we're doing. And this sentiment is typical of what kind of Fisher was trying to get at with his work. But he was also quick to point out that we must mind that things do not need to be this way, right? And I'm just going to read another quote here from Modernism Unbound. Fisher usefully hints in capitalist realism at this idea, whereas much of neoliberalism's success, comes down to the fact that it has managed to sell us its own rubbish version of reality as if that's the ultimate truth. And it was an important idea in sort of popular modernism post-war and can continue to become an important idea now, that the culture and art can actually reimagine our state of being and can actually, we need to be reminded that on the contrary to this idea that this is the ultimate truth, that this medium that we're working with, the future, is actually a plastic medium. It's something we can work with. So to expand on from there, Fisher's saying that capitalist realism has basically gradually narrowed our experience of reality to a state of absolute exhaustion, to the point where the future no longer seems possible for us. But the idea of the burning world, like Amy was saying, and then therefore that everything that we do seems frivolous or a waste of time. I think it also leads to two things then, that sort of mindset. The first is that everything then comes back to us, and there's this like barrage of content that we find ourselves consuming, which is all about personal wealth narratives and kind of solopreneurism, that is all to do with you, that it's not to do with the system above you, that if there's any struggle that you're facing in your life, or if you're not able to do anything interesting with your artwork, that it's all down to you. And it's kind of infected everything. We see it with so many influencer kind of content, particularly directed at men, where it's kind of more clearly in the like hyper masculine kind of content, where it's like, you're not making enough money, therefore you're a waste of space. And then like a little bit more subtle in content aimed at women, where it's like they are creating their own business from home and giving themselves kind of financial freedom through what they're doing. And it also is connected to seeing kind of art universities now as ginormous businesses, not sites of cultural innovation, where the new and kind of forms of thinking about changing the world can happen. It's instead where people are coming and having to part with extreme wealth just to kind of have these small elements of interaction with tutors, and often to kind of buy the name of the university that they can take back into their work. And it kind of keeps us in that cycle of thinking that everything is our fault. If we can't achieve it, that it's something to do with us. The other thing that capitalist realism does, and this idea that the future is burning and there is no future, is that we give into nostalgia. And this is a really important point that I want to drive home today. And there's this book called Retro Utopia by a philosopher called Zygmunt Bauman, which is a fantastic book that I highly recommend reading. It's a bit heavy going, but really interesting. And it was one of the last books he read before he passed away a few years ago. He wrote, sorry, before he passed away a few years ago. And he was saying that in this idea that there is no future that we can imagine, we don't then just fall just into sadness and despair about that. What often happens then is people retreat to the past instead as a way of trying to find some stability that they feel is not now here for them in the future any longer. And that's why we have so much stuff like, let's say, in the States and the UK and around the world, but particularly we can see it here, of this idea of going back to like the old America or the old England, where there's so much disruption at the moment and feeling that you're not in control of your life, that it's like easier to look back on a past that seemed like powerful and everything was together. And of course, what that leads to is people being factioned from one another and starting to blame people for changing that past, which now no longer exists. And it's also why we get so much in music and art and in popular culture of the retro at the moment. And Simon Reynolds, the who is amazing author and music journalist, has written kind of extensively on this idea of the retro and also the development of kind of post-punk and post-wave and new wave art movements and music and things like that. And he argues in his book Retromania that kind of all art now being made at this time has become a kind of feedback loop of itself, of constantly referencing itself. And we see that in things like music, it's kind of 80s synth revivals, endless sequels to things, and vintage filters going on top of stuff. Retro is kind of the default style, constant reissues, remasters, remakes of things, and fashion recycling itself, decades on a loop going over and over, because it's easier in this kind of capitalist realism time for labels, film studios, artists, publishers to invest in something already known, not something new, not something that's going to change anything. And when culture feels uncertain and the future feels dystopian or like it's evaporated, like Fisher was saying, people cling to comforting cultural memories or the idea of, oh, this thing that used to be so solid, which we now don't have any longer. And then the kind of internet turns that into sort of an archival logic, and this loop is just organizing these past cultures into endless playlists or throwbacks or algorithmic pastiches of the past. And then linking that then back to Fisher is saying that the clearest evidence of this hauntology, the past haunting the present continually, is in culture, where this sort of death of the future is emotionally and viscerally felt. And it was originally Derrida, the philosopher, that came up with this concept of hauntology that Fisher's carrying forward. And this kind of hauntology has gained this new currency in the 21st century, where music and art has kind of lost a lot of sense of its futurism, and it's constantly resampling itself because of this sort of retro time post-modernity that we're existing in. So now it's important to say that sort of retro nostalgia, these kind of things, they're not like problems in themselves. I'm not like anti-nostalgia, and neither is Reynolds or Fisher. in their writing. Some retro can be joyful, inventive, or even critical. But I think the problem is when retro becomes the sort of default aesthetic of the 21st century, and it becomes kind of an unconscious habit where we kind of block the emergence of new things coming out of a kind of fear of not knowing what's worthwhile for us to do anymore when things seem so broken and so confusing. And it's not only that, right? Fisher then says, so let's go back to Bauman a second, Zygmunt Bauman in Retrotopia. He's saying there doesn't seem to be this future. Everything seems to be heading towards collapse and dystopia. So we go back to the past. This leads us to nostalgia and looping with the same thoughts and ideas. But not only that, Fisher's saying, he says, we also lament what he calls lost futures. So the futures that we thought were coming that didn't come. And I think that's really interesting as well. So we're in this kind of double lament, a lament that we don't know what's ahead and getting scared and the world seems to be fucking crashing. And then what came out of modernity in late 20th century and all this music and all this art that seemed to happen that got stripped away as the wealth went upwards, as Fisher was saying, then the futures, what all that seemed to promise, is lost as well. And we're just then in this cycle of being on our phones in the attention economy, getting sucked into this loop of trying to just get a like on our post and not knowing what the fuck's happening in the future. So without this sounding all too depressing, I hope it's just like you can see a foundation for us as artists to be thinking like, well, then what's the fucking point? Everything's getting worse. All the futures we were promised didn't come to be. And then even if you're kind of angry at like going into the past, it's like, well, maybe that's a safe way. If I just sort of repeat what's already happened, then maybe I can make enough money to live, etc., etc. But there's a big reframe here, and that's what I want to spend the rest of this time thinking of. Because Fisher was saying, as I was saying earlier, he's saying reality, on the contrary, is not fixed. It's not lost. There isn't just this endless lament for things lost. That the future is plastic and mutable. It's a medium that we can work with. And he says it's about the glimmers and the cracks. It's thus crucial for us to locate the cracks and the inconsistencies that are inevitably a part of any kind of system, even late stage capitalism, and expose the mechanisms behind them in order to begin challenging the dreary realism implemented by late capitalism. That's a great quote, isn't it? And so then coming back to Amy McNee, she's saying we can come back to our art because art gives us agency in a world that we feel too small or constantly demands us to be stuck in the attention economy or profits from us being on our phone or feels that everything's going to shit. Actually, making art becomes an act of rebellion against that very narrative. It becomes a form of hope. It becomes a way of reclaiming attention, reclaiming time for yourself, reclaiming things that are beyond a system that feels completely broken. And this is my reframe then off the back of all this, bringing the whole of that then back to imposter syndrome, is to say this. Have you ever thought about this, that the idea that we can't do anything to change the world, the idea that our art means nothing because everything's going to shit anyway and AI is taking over and the world's burning? Have you thought that that idea might just be imposter syndrome in disguise? That the idea that we cannot change the world might just be the feeling that we don't deserve to change the world, that we're not qualified to change the world, that we're not part of this because only real artists are or real change makers are. What if capitalist realism has sold us, and along with the emotion of imposter syndrome, has sold us an idea that changing the world looks like this person and that's not you? So therefore, you are just stuck making your shitty little art that's really not going to change anything. And in fact, just give up, or in fact, just retreat into the past or retreat into lament, because there's no way of imagining beyond that. What if all of that is just imposter syndrome in disguise? So a few ways to think about that then. If we're thinking that we are coming back to art as a form of agency, as a form of making that is able to change things, because an economy that profits from us being divided and steeped in the attention economy, creating art is the rebellious act, like Amy was saying. And the culture of consumption, when we do less consumption and more creation, is inherently rebellious. What other ways then can we kind of begin to reframe that in our artwork? Well, something that Fisher became sort of preoccupied near the end of his life, he became focused on mental health as a political condition. So the idea that our depression and our mental health issues and our anxiety, which are just massively increasing in our current society, are not to do with personal failures. They're to do with societal structures, and that therefore we need to reclaim joy. So making art and care, being in community, making together as political forces, because they're things that change the world. John, can you see what I'm trying to say here? If mental health is a political condition, then reclaiming joy through our work is a political act. So therefore, you are changing the world. Another way of thinking about it is bringing back long-term thinking. Again, and one of Mark Fisher's key points in capitalist realism is that neoliberalism creates short-termism, constant urgency, perpetual crisis, right? And this kills, again, the idea of futures. And he argued that we need time horizons measured like in decades, not in weeks, you know. And therefore, what we need for creating that environment where we can bring back the new, like he was describing, the future, is public investment, slow art process, research, education, cultural stewardship, long-term thinking is inherently futuristic, and also community, which, as we know from the last few episodes thinking about imposter syndrome, is that the one thing that deconstructs imposter syndrome is finding other people who say, fuck, I feel exactly the same as you. And that is the beginning of changing the world. Yeah. So Svetlana Boyne, who wrote the book The Future of Nostalgia, thinking about this idea of, you know, the past feeling like somewhere we want to retreat to when the present and the future feel so uncertain. She talks about another way we might be able to approach the nostalgia aspect then. If we can begin to see, you know, long-term thinking, reclaiming joy, care through our art as political forces to change the future, to not then fall back into nostalgia. She distinguishes this idea of restorative nostalgia, right, which is kind of trying to rebuild an imagined past. And she distinguishes that from reflective nostalgia, which is critically engaging with the past while still yearning for it. And this kind of maps perfectly on what we're talking about, because we don't want to think, oh, people had it better then or in this day, or if we could only go backwards, or we want to kind of recycle past artistic ideas because that will be more real or something like that, or more sellable, etc. In fact, if we can do reflective nostalgia, so we can look on our past work, on art history with a critical lens, understanding the framework while still yearning for that better time, possibly, then we have a better idea of the relationship between the past and the present, not a kind of framing of time where the past is better than now continuously. Reynolds, then going back to Reynolds, who the music journalist who wrote Retromania, he talks about what artists can begin to do then to get out of this cycle of constantly resampling the past and imagining a better future. And he praises artists who kind of sample rather than reenact. I thought that was quite helpful. And mutate the past rather than preserve it. And use nostalgia critically rather than sentimentally, like Svetlana Boym was just saying. And he says, because innovation, and this is the possibility for the new, that things do change the world, actually starts on fringes. He encourages small scenes, subcultures, microgenres, DIY collectives, non-commercial areas of making, influences from all over the world, experimental communities, digital communities, because he suggests that the new rarely emerges from the corporate center, even if we do need power and finance to make these things happen. The ideas, the imagination doesn't come from within the corporate center. It comes from the fringe, and it comes from imagining a new future, not being stuck in a dystopian idea of the future or in a nostalgic, sentimental idea of the past. If you want the future, says Reynolds, look where the money isn't. I think that's really helpful. And that's important for us as artists, where so much of our life can be colonized by the attention economy. And we feel that we're fighting constantly to be seen, but we're kind of stuck in where the money is, and the money's being extracted from our time on social media and our time constantly doom scrolling, when actually that isn't where the change is going to happen. Yes, we might be able to make connections, but make that connection and then go and do something with it. Yeah. Okay. That's my kind of thesis today. I hope some of that is helpful. The questions tab is open, by the way. I've got a couple of comments here. Oh, thank you, Alex, reposting and saying they're enjoying it. Thank you, friend. I appreciate that. And I hope, a lot of this may seem kind of unformulated in some way, and it's a lot of it is fresh to me as well. But I hope some of this is making sense to you as well. I want to do a few. We've got 40 minutes, so I want to do a few extra things that might be kind of questions coming up, and these I might need to. Yeah, these are a bit less formed, and I might need to sort of expand on these in another episode, but let me know what you think of this. If it comes to looking at the past with a critical eye, as we're saying, I know a couple of people who've talked to me about this before. When the idea of the world is burning, so what can my art do? And we're saying we're reclaiming the creative act as a human act, and that being an inherently powerful and important thing to have done, and that changing the world. But some artists might say to me, yeah, but realistically, I make kind of like abstract shapes on paper, or I make fabric throws, or I write sort of romance fiction. Like, realistically, my work isn't political, it's not important, it's escapist, or it's just pretty or frivolity or something like that. Isn't that a problem when the world is falling apart and burning? Okay, so two ways I want to approach that if you feel like that about your work. The first is that, because, as Amy McNee was saying, and as we've looked across with all these things through Fisher and Reynolds and Svetlana and everyone else we've been looking at, and Baum, they're all saying the same thing. They're saying that the creative act itself is inherently radical, because in a world that constantly pushes you towards consumerism and towards the attention economy, that reclaiming your time is a radical act, and therefore it is inherently political. Yeah. So your art is political. If you are creating art, that is political. I mean, maybe the only way that it wouldn't be political or something like that is if the art was actively harmful. Yeah, if it was doing something that promoted propaganda or racism or bigotry or false narratives, then maybe that would be unhelpful. But otherwise, which I know a lot of you listeners won't be doing that, so otherwise your art is inherently political, no matter what you're speaking about or what your art making is about. Okay, so that's one side that I really want you to encourage. I want to encourage you about that, because as we keep saying, in a world that profits from you being stuck within an extractive surveillance economy and surveillance capitalism that constantly needs you to perform this act of being happy, and happiness all comes back to you, and you've got to look like everything's going okay, etc., etc. Actually just stopping and making some fucking work is rebellious and inherently political, because it puts the power back into your hands and helps you to imagine other futures and connect with others who can do the same. And that's where change comes, just like Reynolds was saying, from the fringes, not from the corporate center. Secondly, if you are feeling that the idea of curiosity, the idea of making something, the idea of like prettiness, or my work is just kind of, abstract shapes or whatever, is inherently problematic, I want to just challenge you on that for a second. Or isn't like inherently stupid when the world is falling apart? So I wanted to go back to Elaine de Botton on this, who's a British philosopher you might have come across before if you've read any of his books. And he runs the School of Life, which has some really cool stuff going on online and in books as well. And he, in a talk about art as therapy, as form of therapy in our life, and as an important part of what it means to be human, just as what Amy McNee was saying, it being a human act, an inherently human act to create. He says that in kind of art history, prettiness by kind of serious artists or like critics or whatever is kind of not allowed. So why paint flowers, or why paint pretty landscapes when there's children dying, when there's cancer, when there's genocide, etc., etc., as if we will sort of forget the darkness if we are kind of obsessed with just silly colors and shapes and things like that, right? But he says, actually, the opposite to that, most of us do not forget the darkness that we are aware of, particularly as artists, where we're constantly switched on thinking about everything that's going around us. And therefore, actually, prettiness and beauty is not something that means that we will escape and forget the darkness. It actually becomes a kind of island, an anchor of hope in a world that feels inherently dark. It's not naive. And he says philosophically, and sort of in terms of the way that we feel as humans, he feels that the more that simple images of happiness and peace and joy, a bunch of flowers on a table, the way the light catches the side of a window, something like that, the more that those things touch us is actually more of a sign that life is not easy, that we are aware of the darkness because we are moved by minute moments of beauty, and that these moments are not sentimental, therefore, or pretty or stupid, that they are a life raft for many of us to remember a future that could be, to not just get stuck into the past or lament that our future's never arriving or constantly see dystopia on the horizon, that actually a life raft of beauty, it would be something revealing a small moment that restores hope. Of course, there is the other side as well, where there can be sentimental paintings, and I've definitely seen those. But I would say a lot of those are much more like unrealities. They're fictions. They're kind of representations of a life that doesn't exist, and that's the retrotopia that we were just talking about. That is inherently sentimental because it paints a picture that is false, that doesn't exist. Whereas capturing moments of prettiness and beauty in life are signals towards the fact that we can find moments of hope. So therefore, if curiosity feels like an indulgence to you, actually curiosity again is an inherently radical act. Alex Mack, the great photographer, is on with us. Hi, Alex. Curiosity is the only thing that can save us. I'm coming to believe that more and more. And I know I banged on about this so much in the last couple of weeks, and I did an episode on curiosity a few weeks ago. Please go and check it out. It's called Will Curiosity Survive the Art World? You can find it on the live section of the live drop down section on the Healthy Artist YouTube channel, but I will put it up on the main channel soon. this idea that curiosity can save us. I've been thinking about this. Something that Martha, my co-host on the Healthy Artist, said to me a couple of months ago in one of our episodes, where she said curiosity in this kind of late stage capitalist times begins to feel like an indulgence, like the idea that um, you have to get everything right the first time. You can't be playing around, mucking around. Real artists don't do that. They just do it right. Whereas I'm just wasting my materials and my money and everything like that being curious. But actually, as Alex is saying, curiosity is the thing that breaks us out of that cycle of thinking, that breaks us out of an extractive and capitalist realist viewpoint where everything must have monetary and profitable value. It must be you must be able to see the metrics of each decision that you make. Being curious and not knowing where you're going, and experimental and exploring your territory and your map actually will make you an inherently more political, more real, and more engaged creator. Thanks for that, Alex. I appreciate you logging in so often as you do, and sharing everything. So love you lots. Hope you are well. In finishing, then, thinking about curiosity, indulgence, and frivolity, I recently, well, we got about 5 minutes left, so let's finish with this for now. I recently got to see in real life The Swing by Fragonard, which is like the classic Rococo painting. If you've never seen it, I'm sorry I don't have a slide of it here or anything, because I just was writing this before I came on some of these new ideas. Search it up, just type in The Swing, it will come up straight away. And it's a kind of the touchstone work of the Rococo, and it's of a woman in a very flouncy, flowery, over the top pink billowing dress on a swing being pushed, and her slipper is flying off. It's very erotic, it's very sensual, it's very playful, over the top. It's the whole composition feels kind of unreal. It's very staged, and it's actually really small, which was as often a surprise with these things, isn't it? And it was painted just for a private commission, not necessarily going to be put out into the rest of the world. But it became one of the cornerstones of the Rococo period, which was so much about excess, about frivolity, about joy, about love, about fun. But there was major criticisms to the Rococo period when it was up, and that's because it was seen as not serious art, because it was just the fantasies of the aristocracy, their time mucking around with all the money that they've got while everyone else is struggling in the world, right? Something again of, you can hear the language here of what we've been talking about. Why paint frivolous imagery when there's all this real struggle in the world? And that just this indulgence needs to be smashed down. And then, so from the Rococo period, what came after that was the Enlightenment scholars, and they really pushed against this idea of Rococo frivolity, saying, how can you make this when there's no real moral, important philosophical discussion going on here, when there's so much poverty, when there's so much disgrace in the world? However, looking back on that time, a lot of feminist scholars now, and queer scholars in particular, have looked back at kind of Rococo design and have rethought about what that Enlightenment beating down of the expression of joy might have been about. Now, Rococo was inherently very queer and very female and very domestic. A lot of the work showed women enjoying themselves. Yeah. It was very intimate, very sensual, very decorative, focused on things like relationships, interiors, feelings, all these things that would be championed by women or sort of experienced by women at the time. And also, a lot of the early patrons of Rococo were women as well. So when Enlightenment kind of critics say this is frivolous and not, serious, what actually a feminist scholar looking back on this can see: too feminine, not serious, not rational enough, not moral enough. And therefore, when you think about it, the Enlightenment was so masculine coded in terms of virtues of reason, order, and public life. And Rococo wasn't aligned with that masculine coded idea about what was important in the world. Softness, ornament, pleasure, all socially within the masculine coded idea of the Enlightenment, feminized traits, which we know to be nonsense, right? But so the kind of the takedown of this frivolity of the Rococo period often reads as, we're delegitimizing the feminine so that the masculine can come back and take over culture again, take over the cultural narrative. So, and then more postmodern critics note that this sort of then return to virtue, the virtuous, politically engaged real person, rather than this sort of frivolous playing aristocrat, actually wasn't just about taste. It was about politically realigning art and our worldview back to male coded forms of power, citizenship, politics, stuff like that. And politics meaning, the city. And if you see then the work that comes out of that afterwards, it's often then back to being portraits of men in powerful positions, men arguing in the public square, men, and then biblical themes of lots of men inside. And it kind of says that rationality is greater than emotion. The public is more important than the private. And, civic heroism is so much more important than intimate pleasure. So therefore, masculine coded values are more important than feminine coded values. So that Rococo becomes the kind of scapegoat that let, neoclassicism claim moral authority afterwards. That's just a little side quest there for you about the Rococo. I've just become obsessed with this swing painting recently, and how we might reread it. But coming back to then imposter syndrome and all this idea of making a new world, I think it connects with this idea of, well, if everything's burning and the whole world's falling apart, how can I make frivolous, pretty, beautiful art? But I want to remind you again, what is the reason why you might be saying that? Might there be an imposter syndrome in the fact that these are very masculine coded ideas of what it means to be political and what it means to be moral and important? Because joy in a world that's full of shit is political. Yeah, the idea of focusing on the sensual, the decorative, the feminine, the kind of relationships interior that the Rococo did, and the championing of those ideas is inherently political when we're kind of being focused again to be these solopreneur masculine figures, when it comes to things like social media and the rest of the way that we find ourselves promoting our artwork. I was about to say then, am I saying that social media is inherently kind of misogynistic or masculine? That's another episode, isn't it? That's another episode. Wow. Maybe I'll leave you leave you with that thought. But yes. Okay. Anything else I wanted to tell you in my millions of notes here? Yes. I just want to finish with the idea that, taking time again to, in the attention economy, and where that's colonized every part of our life, taking time to witness the world, to see, to say what's happening simply is political. It's political to be active in a world that increasingly demands passivity. And I'm not saying fear mongering, like, oh God, look at how bad everything is, but deconstructing power systems and saying, does that make sense? Or by doing prettiness and beauty and abstraction and these things, by showing us, look at this form of hope that isn't tied to capital, that isn't tied to value in the sense of metric value. And I just want to say as well that I want you to just start taking yourself and your work more seriously. And by that, I mean playing. I want you to focus on serious play. And I think I will do an episode about that next week because I think it's really important. I want you to focus on serious trial and error this week because that is an act that will change the world. I want you to have serious reflections, serious imaginations of what's going on now. And I want you to give yourself space to do that because that's the opposite of being an imposter when it comes to imposter syndrome, to bring this all to a close, this series. Because in imagining things within your work and with others, that is inherently creating community, and you cannot be an imposter in a community that you are building. Yeah, that is starts with creating and imagining things different to what is there. You're only an imposter based on the fake ideas, like we heard right back at the start of the series and last week when we were talking about this imagination that everyone thinks differently to what I do, which is called where was it? Pluralistic ignorance. This idea that everyone thinks differently to me and I'm the only one who struggles and thinks like I do, which was last week's episode, and why that's so important for us as artists to deconstruct that. But when we do this thing with others, it inherently unlocks that. And there was a really nice quote that I saw by a musician. She's an orchestral musician called Nicole Hand. And she said, "You're not a guest on stage, you're part of the orchestra." I found that really helpful. And it was literally talking about her orchestral kind of journey from being a young musician to being like coming into the orchestra, but feeling like she was a guest on stage and not part of it, but realizing that she was part, of course, she was part of the whole thing. We've got to remember that it's inherently political and powerful and world-changing to take up space, to use our voice, to create beautiful things, and to be part of the world. Politics, literally, the etymology of politic is about pertaining to the public life of people. Yeah, it's people around us. So, friends, that's it. 1, 2, 3 episodes on imposter syndrome. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's quite a big group of you in here today, so I really appreciate it. I hope something of that crazy, unformulated last few weeks, which I'm wrestling with as well and excited to be journeying with you about as well, is I hope something of that has stuck out to you. If you want to see the other episodes, if you missed them, please go back onto the live page of the YouTube channel and please subscribe to the YouTube channel as well, because it means that the videos go out further. We've got loads of great videos on there about establishing yourself in the art world. We've got the whole course called the Artist Toolkit, part 1 and 2, about how to get yourself established and going in the art world. We've got things about administration. We've got things about community and competition, all these kind of subject matters. And if you enjoyed today and you want to kind of hear more of my gorgeous voice, balanced with the voice of Martha Lamont, and if these sort of subjects are interesting to you, then please go and listen to the Healthy Artist podcast. We've got a new episode coming out tomorrow, and yeah, good things are coming up with the Healthy Artist. We've got our first IRL group meetup in January, and Martha is running some amazing online courses and a mentorship program for artists wanting to push forward to the next stage in their practice. So if you want to hear about that, just go to thehealthyartist.com and down to courses, and you'll see everything there. And they are selling, so I would recommend go and take a look as soon as you can and look at booking definitely before the end of the year, so you don't miss that start in January, because it's, as I say, they are getting booked up. Thank you, friends. I will, if you, you want to see this full series, I will put them together into either one long video, maybe one long video and separate videos as well. You can let me know what you would prefer. Episodes 1, 2, and 3, and put them on the main channel in the next few weeks, as in when I got the time to go through and re-upload them. But I really appreciate you joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. I'm going to go and pick up my little boy from school, and I will see you next Wednesday for more talk about serious play, I guess, in the studio. Bye for now, friends. Thank you.